So it's down to intent.
Very good. Thank you, John. John, will you take a seat here because you're staying up here? I hope Kieran was listening. Kieran, are you going to encourage us all in NUIG to have a side hustle? Is that what you call it, John?
Yes.
Yeah, we'll see how that works out. Okay. Can I invite up our first panel of the day, please? Led and chaired by Professor Alma McCarthy, who is our Professor of Public Sector Management. I think we're all interested in that today. And Alma is our head of our J.E. Cairns School of Business and Economics. Alma's research interests include such things as public sector leadership, human resource development, training, work-life balance. I think we're going to hear that a lot today, 360-degree feedback. Alma's pulled together a panel here. I'll let her introduce them, but essentially what they're speaking to really is hybrid working, a model for success, good practices, I suppose, as we all grapple with hybrid working. My iPad is running all day. If you've got questions prompted by anything that comes up from this panel discussion, please do type them in. I'll be popping up later. Alma is calling the shots, but I'll be feeding some of your questions through to Alma and the panel once her discussion is over. So thanks for that, and now over to you, Alma.
Thank you, John, and thanks to the organisers. It's a fantastic schedule that's ahead for the day, and I'm sure that all participants will get great value from the session and from the programme today. So I'd like to warmly welcome my panelists here with me this morning. First off is Louise O'Byrne from Arthur Cox, an employment law group partner with them. And of course, if anyone's joining and hasn't heard John's presentation earlier, John is Director of Support and Chair with Shopify International Limited and Chair of the Board of Grow Remote. And Tomás O'Sheacháin is CEO of Western Development Commission and member of the National Hubs Network Steering Group and the National Remote Work Strategy Implementation Group. So it's great to have you all here this morning, and thanks a million for joining us.
Thank you.
So our panel topic that we've been asked to speak on is hybrid working, a model for success with a question mark. And I suppose it's been very interesting to listen to John this morning, focused on the fully remote context. And we're all sort of in that space of hybrid working at the moment. So I might start with yourself, Tomás, and you've done a lot of work even with ourselves at IUA Galway and the Whitaker Institute, looking at some of the national remote working surveys and data we've done in the surveys over the last year and a half. So in your own experience in the Western Development Commission and more broadly even with clients, what do you think is the pulse and the sense of the hybrid working model, and how does it look going forward?
I think it looks, it's at a point in time, I think it's going to change significantly. One of the most challenging things, I think, and I think this is probably borne out by what John said earlier on, is that in many ways, the hybrid approach is more difficult. So if you have a fully in-house experience, as we've all been familiar with, if you have a fully remote experience, it allows you to put things in place. In any organization that I've ever worked in, communication is the single biggest challenge. It's very often the most underfunded area in any organization because everybody assumes it takes care of itself. I think in the remote working context, the single most important challenge for employers and for leadership within every business is to make sure that a conscious decision is made to take an approach that works. So from our point of view as a state agency, we took the decision during the summer to move to a remote first model. Now, what that means is that all meetings take place remotely unless agreed otherwise. We then come together on a team basis at least once a fortnight and come together as a staff once a month. So what that means is that you have to actively work at making sure that communication is in place and is supported throughout. What we see throughout the client companies is that broadly, and I think again, as John has touched on, big corporate companies are in a position to manage this because very often they have dedicated HR divisions, they have specialists in the area, and they have the resources to bring in those specialists to figure out how all of this is going to work. Where I think the public sector equally is tending to move en masse. I think it's something that won't be a challenge for those. However, one group that I am particularly concerned about, I think, and that would be both the client base of ours from the point of view of our investment fund, but also as the backbone of employment within the Western region and outside the major urban centres, are SMEs. SMEs across all different areas, whether you look at digitalization, whether you look at remote work, they very often are solely focused on reaching the end of the month and paying their bills. The opportunity to step back and see how this will work for them is a particular challenge. So I think, first of all, as our joint work has shown in the context of remote working, that there is a broad appetite to continue to work remotely. As part of that, we have taken a step further to address some of the challenges that were raised in the research that we did about the potential issues around social isolation and others like that. And we're developing the National Hubs Network, connectedhubs.ie. So it's allow people to work on their doorstep within an office type environment. And we see that as a good opportunity to address some of the benefits of hybrid working. But finally, I think this is absolutely something that is laid at the door of employers and business leaders. The leadership must come from the top. It must be a conscious decision. And the key aspect to consider always is communication. And that won't happen by accident.
Yeah, okay. And maybe if I turn to you, Louise, what have you seen, even with, you know, your clients and advice that you've been giving, what do you see as some of the kind of key challenges that some of your clients have been grappling with? And what advice have you been giving them in that space?
Well, I suppose the key issue that I'm seeing is that your employment obligations as an employer don't go away, irrespective of the platform that you're working from, be it hybrid or fully remote. And certainly, obviously, John's experience is slightly different, but the vast majority of employers, this is a whole new world for them. And they are really struggling with how to manage that, because when somebody's in an office, you can see if they're visibly stressed, you can see if they're struggling under, you know, with a particular interpersonal relationship. It's more difficult, or certainly that's a lot of my clients' experience, is that it's more difficult to identify the issues. And what happens is issues are snowballing, and then they're getting out of control, and the reaction to what otherwise would be a relatively innocuous issue in a workplace environment becomes a far bigger issue, and that's creating bigger employer liability, I suppose. So it's about, and that is a difficult nut to crack in terms of how to get that right. And it's about, back to communication, and I think we're all singing from the same hymn sheet in relation to that, but ensuring that communication is happening in such a way that there's enough touch points with the right people at the right time throughout the day or throughout the week. And I you know, your suggestion is a really good one, Paul, in terms of, you know, this is the policy. We're remote first when it comes to meetings, and there is an exception to that, but everybody knows what that is. Everybody knows when they need to show up, when FaceTime is going to happen. Another issue that I'm seeing kind of coming through, and it's more of a kind of a forward-looking issue, is in this hybrid environment, the vast majority of employers are saying, look, we allow this flexibility, but it's up to you whether you avail of it or not. We're not mandating you to avail of the flexibility. That's what the vast majority of people, in my experience, are doing. I see that being a big issue, because those who avail of flexibility are then going to be less visible. And how does that, I suppose, span through to employment opportunities, to diversity, to inclusion, to indirect discrimination and direct discrimination in some instances. So they're the kind of issues that employers are grappling with. And you know, very few people have it cracked when they're in a hybrid working environment, but it's identifying the issue, investing the time in planning what the workplace looks like for you. And I suppose one of the issues is, our management bought into this really, or our management looking at this as we have to do it to attract and retain talent, but we're not really bought into it. And unless you're bought into it, you're not really going to deal with those softer issues until there's a big problem.
Yeah, and of course that's when it's very challenging then.
Yeah.
And John, very interesting this morning. Obviously, your context is fully remote, and a lot of the discourse and projections are for a hybrid model, which of course is very different in many ways. What do you see as the challenges? You know, I think it's clear that you would be very much promoting the fully remote. What do you see as the real challenges ahead for organizations and with the hybrid model, which is different again to the fully remote model?
Let me just put a bit of context on it first of all. And I think this is an easy way to look at it, is that, you know, and I'm going to use very rough numbers. These are just kind of directionally correct. 20% of people don't ever want to leave the home again and want to work from home. Probably 20% of people want to go back to the office, absolutely the first available opportunity. These are just rough numbers. That leaves a big fat swathe of 60% of people in the middle who are moving left, moving right, not quite sure. So there's massive confusion, massive uncertainty. And that's a real challenge for everybody. And I think Louise sort of made the point very, very tellingly that it's down to whether management is bought in. It actually boils down to a skill set. Does management feel that they actually have the skill set to understand and recognize the signs that you could actually see in a face-to-face world. And what I would postulate is that there's a different skill set, slightly different skill set that's required for people to manage in the online world, online only world. And there are subtle signs that you need to see and you need to understand. You need to be able to read, instead of reading the room, you need to be able to read the Zoom. You have to understand when somebody is not participating in a meeting. The subtle signs of people with cameras off. Why? It may be for perfectly good reasons and rational stuff, but it may also be that not willing to participate. And so what I would say is that for hybrid to work, there's a skill set change that's required of the leadership team and of the management team. And to me, this all starts at the most senior level. If you have the most senior level of an organization buying into it, and as Tomas said a while ago, it's really great that companies and organizations are actually putting out a statement. So you're saying remote first. So all meetings are first and foremost remote. We as a company are now digital by design. Okay, so everything that we're doing, for example, when I mean digital by design, we've actually taken a group of engineers and we've put them on a project to develop a virtual meeting place full of avatars and gaming stuff. Look, I'm 55, it's way over my head. I showed it to my kids and they thought it was just amazing. But that's the adaptation that companies need to make to a new future. And I would say I'm a bit of a geriatric in this space. And I think we need to actually look at people who are the next wave of middle management and ask them, what are they seeing and feeling and hearing? Because look, my age group don't have our finger on the pulse enough. And if we think we can make decisions, I think, we are like dinosaurs signing our own death warrant.
Yeah, it's interesting because I would agree with you. It's really the next generation making sure that we're connected, and a lot of the time leaders and managers are beyond that. And what is it that the next generation of employees want is what we really need to be tapped into. And leading on from that, Tomas, John, you're right. The mindset change is a huge one that's needed. What is the likes of your own organisation, Tomas, doing around that in terms of supporting leaders and managers to transition away from what was the Monday to Friday 9 to 5, whatever notion we were a couple of years ago, to what really looks like a very different landscape, whatever shape and form it takes in terms of how much will be hybrid and the extent of it. But I think we're all accepting that it will be hybrid. We're not going back, I don't think, at this stage to 2018. What are you doing, or what do you think organizations need to do to help leaders and managers make that transition so they are effectively managing in what is going to be a very different world?
I think Louise touched on a couple of important points. First of all, there are certain cohorts I think that are really at risk. And one of the areas that was identified as part of the work we did in the National Remote Work Strategy was that those at the early stage of their career, when you build those informal networks that really sustain you all throughout your career, it's very important to have the opportunity to build those. So a good example I've seen of that is, let's say, in a professional setting, an engineering consultancy, where they have now arranged that all those at the early stage in their career come in 5 days a week, and then the partners and senior staff rotate. So they do the 2 days a week. They do it on the basis that when they're in the office, they're engaging, they're mentoring, they're actively managing those that are at the early stage. The second cohort I'd be particularly worried about, and I think this is interesting, particularly in the Western context, is that if you look at, let's say, the predominant employment areas within this region, for example, there's a huge emphasis in terms of retail and tourism. And what we see is that, let's say, young women in particular were predominantly impacted by the pandemic more than other cohorts. I think there is a danger that, let's say, where cohorts like that become, let's say, slightly detached from the workforce, that they then have to cross the barrier, a skills barrier, to ensure that they come back into the workforce. So it's very important that this doesn't become something that's offered to young parents with families, to those, of parenting age, and certain cohorts are completely isolated within the workplace. And that leads into the final element, which is that this concept of out of sight, out of mind. So where there are opportunities within the workplace, the benefit of the fully remote model that many of us saw for the last 18 months was everybody was on a level playing field, and John touched on that. And I think where you didn't have you know, 3 people in the room and 3 people outside the room, that there isn't this division. So I think it's really important that there's a equality of opportunity. And all of these, I think, go back to taking a proactive approach to manage that. So when people are together, that is clear they're together, that there is clarity about how that is managed. And I think, to be honest, it's interesting in that I think the Western Development Commission is a good case in point. The nature of the work of the organization meant that since it was established in just after 2000, there was a telework project, telework policy in place since 2003. Now, what we've seen since is that, you know, the advent of technology in around the late 2000 and 2010 meant that it was more feasible to do remote work. Then the shift towards sustainability meant that there was actually an increased appetite for remote work and ultimately an improvement in terms of work-life balance. So I think what we've seen over the last 18 months is a change in the employer mindset, because very often what happened in situations was it was a one-to-one relationship between a manager and an employee where they say, you know, Mary or John work Tuesdays at home, but we don't get into it. Nobody talks about it. It's just a one-to-one agreement. Some of the research that we've done in the WDC has identified that this is cyclical. So when you look at an increased employment, you see the shift from, let's say, the employer to the employee. So in other words, people with high skills are in high demand and they can say, I'll take the job, but on the following basis. So I won't be in Tuesdays and Thursdays or whatever works for me. I think the opportunity is now there to formalize that. And that's what we've seen. So a lot of what was happening at a lower level has increased, it's accelerated, but now I think is the opportunity to codify it and establish it on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, we knew there were a lot more opportunities with technology, but there was a laziness almost to adapt that until we had to. And now I think people have really been very, well, our national survey data would say that, very surprised at how well it actually has worked for many. And of course, there are challenges. And Louise, I suppose in the employment context and law context, what would you see as kind of a couple of, we say, the top 2 or 3 issues that organizations need to really consider in moving to a hybrid model that you'd see as maybe red flag areas that need particular attention, particular training, and particular focus?
Well, I'm not convinced that this model has led to greater work-life balance, certainly up until now. And obviously, you know, certainly what I'm seeing on the ground is people's, and I think, John, you said it yourself in terms of now that you're working fully remote, you're working longer and harder than you've ever done before. I think that is my experience in Arthur Cox, and I think that's my experience among the vast majority of my clients. So I do think it's incumbent on employers to kind of say, guys, you know, all we should be getting is what we got before, not more. And how do we manage that? And obviously, you know, there's certain legislative changes coming down the road in terms of, obviously, you know, the Organisation of Working Time Act has always been there. Obviously now we have a statutory code of practice on the right to disconnect, which my colleague Kevin will discuss later. And all of that is obviously there, but there's always been legislation there. So we've always been bound to work a certain amount of hours. You know, how does that work? How is that tracked? It's more difficult to deal with that in a remote working environment and a hybrid working environment. But again, and I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself, but again, you need to walk the walk as a senior manager. You need to be seen to be doing things. And it's back to the cohorts of people I think that you've identified, because they're my 2 big concerns: the marginalized people, for want of a better description, and the well-being side and the stress and the overwork side of things. And it's about walking the walk from a manager's perspective and saying, hang on a minute, do I need to send this email at 11:30 at night? Do I save it into my drafts? Do I time it to issue at a particular point in time? Because all of the feedback from junior employees particularly is, if I get it, even though somebody says, look, this isn't urgent, I don't need you to come back to me before tomorrow evening, it's still playing on people's minds. It's still there. It's, you know, it's unread if you don't read it. So you're querying, well, what could this possibly be about? And I do think that's a big issue. And the Health and Safety Authority have published guidelines on this. They're looking at it. There's, you know, as long as I've been an employment lawyer, I've dealt with personal injuries cases in the High Court with stress and bullying and overwork. And it's very difficult for an employer 4 or 5 years down the line to say, well, hang on a minute, I actually didn't expect this standard of performance. I didn't know that this was actually happening on the ground, and I had no visibility that this person was responding to the challenges of work in the way they were. But as an employer, you're always on the back foot in that scenario. So proactive steps need to be taken. And if there's any, you know, whatever about what your policies say, if there's warning signs, you need to be kind of coming down on them quickly and firmly and consistently across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. So John, I mean, you have a lot of experience that we can draw on. I mean, one of the issues that has come up in our research we did in IUA Galway with Tomas and WGC was one of the biggest challenges was around isolation and loneliness. Now, I think it's hard to know whether that was impacted by the pandemic situation where, you know, the normal social context was also limited in what we were doing at that time with public health guidelines. What do you do in Shopify to keep people connected, and what kind of in-person events, and how do you manage that element of the work?
I think the best way to talk about this is to go back to when we were in the fully remote arena pre-pandemic, because that really is what we're going to end up repeating. I mean, for us, it's easier to say we'll go back to what it was, because what it was is really the target that a lot of companies are looking for. So you go back to 2018 and 2019, and where we had a pocket of people, whether it be, and we have, you know, it's like I mentioned, we've, you know, approximately 200 in Galway, we've approximately the same in Cork, we're close enough in Dublin, we've a group in Limerick, but like I said, we're spread everywhere. We encourage organic groups of people to get together, and we actually cover the cost of them renting a room in a co-working space for a day, and what we call a pop-up office. Just come in for the day. Everybody does the thing that they would do in their home office, on their laptop, in a conference room, in a hotel, or in a conference room in a co-working space. And we refer to it as a co-working day, pop-up office or a co-working day. It's a very simple concept. What it does is even more simple. It gives, we all have this visceral want to belong. This is the community. This is the opportunity to sit side by side with a kindred spirit who's drawing a paycheck from the same company, and to feel like you're part of something. We all want to be part of a greater purpose or a greater mission. And if you do it by simply doing the exact same work that you do in your home office, in a conference room, in a co-working space that's a couple of miles down the road, that's great. So what Tomas was talking about earlier on with you know, all the network of co-working hubs that exists around Ireland, they will be the most incredibly important bolt hole for every company in the country if they use it correctly. It's not necessarily a case of, oh, I'm going to unbundle this 3,000 person office in Dublin and I'm going to send everybody to a co-working space down the country. No, it's afford people the flexibility to work from home, but provide them with the artillery to go and actually be part of a community. So another really simple thing that we do as well, and like this is moronically simple, is we have a map of the country, right? And we have, like any of the kids would know, Snap Map, where you can see where everybody is. And we allow people to notify on, you know, it's obviously, it's not a, it's at their own discretion to essentially identify themselves on the map. And we don't identify exactly where somebody is, but in the general, you know, kind of a kilometer or so radius. What that affords you to do is, you're living in Clonakilty in West Cork. You're able to see who is within driving distance of you. That then becomes, oh, I'm going to call Pat and go and have a cup of coffee with him. Right? So we enable people to make those connections. We don't force it. Absolutely don't force it. And that is the critical thing. Give people the opportunity to collect or gather together if they so wish, but don't force it.
Do you encourage it?
We enable it. We do encourage it. But for example, there are a couple, I've been nearly 5 years at Shopify, and there's some people I've never met. And that's fine. It's totally fine. They don't come to our annual. We also then, what I'm talking about is kind of an ongoing thing. We then have a large gathering every year where we get everybody together. In fact, the last one we had actually was in this hotel in the Galmont. So we do that. And that's a great opportunity for most people to gather. And it's kind of like the great, it's a great kind of 2 or 3 day event. It's great fun, but we don't mandate it. And that's the critical thing. Because if you do mandate it, you're actually going to impact some people who are very introverted, or you know, who may for certain reasons not want to connect with other people. That's fine. Just be productive, do your job, be a contributor, but do it on your terms, not our terms, the employer. Do it on your terms, the employee.
Very good. And another big issue that comes up in the discourse is how to, what's maybe potentially lost in a remote context is the collaboration, and that what comes out of innovations that come out of people connecting, and the corridor conversations and coffee conversations. Maybe Tomas, what do you think is important for organizations to consider in managing that element of work, the innovation and collaboration piece and ideas that come out of that?
So I think one or two of the things, I think there are very practical steps that should be taken. So first of all, for example, one of the things that we've done is we've created those, let's say, virtual social settings where we bring everybody together during the pandemic. And now since we've looked at actually bringing people together in person. But the other thing we've done is we've actually created an innovation space. So once a fortnight, we have a short meeting, 45 minutes, where we will take the opportunity to come in and pitch. It doesn't need to be a work-related idea. It's just a new idea or something I saw somewhere. We call it the Journal and Ideas Club. So I read something in the paper, I saw something in a journal. Actually, this is really interesting. Could we try this? So I think that at a micro level within our organization is important. I think we're now seeing, and probably this week, I've been at 2 events outside the house, which is very exciting in itself. But we can now see, I'm certainly seeing an increased appetite for in-person events, and that they are moving up the kind of, their appeal is increasing because of the fact that people have been withdrawn from them for so long, but they now see greater opportunity in it. And I think the development of events like this in a kind of a hybrid space is a really exciting area to be in. Because having come from a background in broadcasting, I can see a lot of the budgets that were once in television and that kind of thing now moving into this event and virtual and hybrid space. So I think it's a really, really exciting area to be in. The final thing I would say is, and John mentioned the connected hubs and that national network of hubs. At the moment, there are over 160 on that network, and we've mapped over 450 across the country. And at connected hubs, you can see where they all are. But they allow people to come in and share that. And what's most interesting in terms of the work that we've done, let's say we have network sessions every second week, there's a huge attendance. So this is primarily driven by those managers who they form many of the roles that, let's say, people traditionally would have found within companies, but were unspoken roles. So a lot of the research around innovation in companies finds that there's a connector. So a person who brings people together, who doesn't necessarily come up with the idea, but says, actually, you should talk to Alma. Alma mentioned that to me last week. And that this is emerging in an organic way in some of these meetups and hubs, but crucially, not only within the hub, but because of the network effect across the regions, you now can see that connecting both the virtual and the physical. And I think where that offers an opportunity, again, looking at the point of view in terms of at a societal level, it will first of all allow people to leave cities. It won't empty out cities in any of the work that we've done. You're talking at perhaps around 10% of movement, which will be enough to sustain rural and regional areas, but not necessarily empty cities. The key thing that I think we will find is that the people will give more time back. And that's something that we haven't successfully captured as yet, but we're very focused on doing it. So there'll be a broader societal and economic impact. There will be a sustainability impact that John touched on earlier on that I think will be hugely important and which will become a driver over time for companies in their ESG and CSR reporting. But I think fundamentally it is a combination of both. I think we're at the start of a journey now that this is an area in terms of hybrid events, in terms of innovation development, that there will be a very exciting period over the next 3 to 5 years as new ideas come to the fore and people find solutions. I'm sure John's going to market the solution that they've built, but people find solutions to crack that problem because that, like so many other problems that we face, is something that will improve over time. And I think companies will adapt and learn, but again, on the basis of making the commitment to examine it, to engage with it and to find a solution.
John, you definitely want to come in here.
Yeah, there's one thing that I actually don't buy with all of this is that real innovation and real collaboration happens just through unintentional meetups in an office and over the water cooler. In my experience, I've seen many more bad things coming from water cooler conversations than good things. And what I really think is a change in management and leadership philosophy to provide the tools that enable people to collaborate. And there are some magnificent, phenomenal tools. If anybody wants to go check on the Grow Remote website, there's a list of all of the collaboration tools out there. mind-boggling, the array of tools. And it's just a case of sharpening your toolkit, changing the tools, and don't rely. I mean, the company that relies on the water cooler to get a project done, I think, is something that's with that's the 1980s, folks.
Yeah, so that's you're questioning that for sure, John. And Louise, I've just got a time indication, so we might leave maybe the last word to you, if that's okay. What do you see as sort of maybe the most exciting element of hybrid in terms of the employee work experience into the future, that if it's managed properly from an employment relations perspective, etc., is something that is most appealing?
Yeah, well, I think the breadth of people to whom hybrid working is now being offered would never have happened was it not for the pandemic. And even from our organization, like, I think I can safely say that secretaries and general support staff would never have been afforded the opportunity to work remotely. And those were the people who were coming from Kildare and coming from Meath, as opposed to coming 2 miles from the office. So that is massively positive. And I'm really delighted that this experiment has allowed that cohort of employees to avail of this and will be able to avail of this going forward, because they're not necessarily the cohort of employees that there's a war on talent in relation to, for example. So that's massively positive. And I do think once we get the work-life balance, and I'm not a massive lover of that phrase, work-life balance, but once we do get, you know, structure around that, that people can, that work, you know, floats in around life, that you can, to a certain extent, have it all, that you can have autonomy and that you can deliver good quality value work, but it's not, it doesn't happen overnight, and it's not something that just, you know, you don't wake up and you have the perfect structure. You have to invest time, you have to invest energy, and you have to have the goodwill backing it at every layer of the organization. And if there are naysayers, and that's where I'm finding employment issues arise, where there are people who are paying lip service to particular policies and procedures kind of across the board, it's a recipe for disaster. So that's what needs to be focused on. Yeah, but future is bright. I do think this is a very positive development, and there's great opportunities there.
I suppose the rule book has been just torn up, and it's organizations that respond and are agile to the new normal, they'll succeed and do well. John, have we any questions from our online participants?
We have a few, and a few came in there at the last minute. I think everybody was engrossed with the discussion, and well done, Alma. Obviously, you were asking the questions that they were all thinking. Here are some of our people at home, and I want to put some questions to you. So you have great distinct perspectives, but I suppose all the people watching in, or the majority, are from a university context, okay? And one of the concerns that came up in the chat is, our line managers, and think about the people watching in, many of them are managing teams, are they tooled up? Do they have the skill set really to manage teams in this kind of hybrid environment? And I wonder, do you have any advice from your perspectives around how how universities can support managers to develop those skills? And you would just grab that one.
Well, just to briefly jump in front of you, John, and you may be about to say the same thing as a colleague of John's in terms of Grow Remote. We're actually going through the Grow Remote training at the moment, which I think many of those within the organization and outside said, well, I thought you've been doing this for years. I think there is always the opportunity to learn more, and I've found it a really, really good experience.
Exactly that point, and it will probably be the best example of a training course of a company that you wouldn't have expected to do training on working remote. The Aer Lingus engineering team was one of the first teams that went through the Grow Remote training course, and you'd never really think that an airline's engineering department would be able to work remote, and they became probably the poster. Kevin Toohey and his team became the poster children for that approach. There are training courses there. Do not assume that you have the skill set. We work all the time remote, and there are things that we have learned from looking at the curriculum from Grow Remote on how to actually embrace remote work. It's out there. Don't assume you have the skill set.
Good. Thanks, John. And a great plug there from both of you from Grow Remote. I know that you mentioned earlier on the buy-in is needed from senior management. And I suppose the challenge we have there is your business model was set up around remote working. It was kind of forced upon us, right? The pandemic brought this to our door, and some people might be in a rush to emerge from it. So, you know, and the fear is that a few years down the road, we won't have picked up all the benefits that the last year and a half in pandemic crisis circumstances brought to us. So could I maybe go to each of the panelists and maybe think, what is your strongest argument for really investing time, effort and resources into continuing a healthy remote working policy and practice? Maybe starting with you, Louise.
I think it's the bottom line. I think it's as blunt as that. It's the commercial reality. It's like investing in diversity. It goes to your bottom line, and without investing in this now and seriously buying into it, I think your organization will be a lesser entity at the end of it. So it's as blunt as that from my perspective.
John, top line.
I'm actually going to add on to that as well. I made the point earlier on about the cost of actually housing an employee in an office. Your biggest competitor, and let's take this out of the public sector arena and into the corporate world for a second. The disruptors out there do not have that cost structure, and they'll eat your lunch. And there's an equivalent to that in the public sector, which I presume everybody else can work out, but they'll eat your lunch, and you can't let that happen.
Anything to add from us?
Yes, just one of the most interesting things from the research we did was that there was no discernible impact on productivity. And that's, let's say, based on the data, but separately in all of the anecdotal feedback that I would have got from other managers, and I think there's a lesson in this, effectively, those who were productive before remote work continue to be productive. Those who were not productive before remote work continue to be non-productive. So many of the challenges that face HR managers remain, and they're now just virtual challenges, which may in some cases provide solutions, but equally may mean that you may need to take other steps. So in many ways, the world may not have changed all that much.
Can I just interject? There was one of the biggest studies ever done on this was in 2013 by a guy called Nicholas Bloom from Stanford, who did it with a company called C-Trip in China. So this was long before the pandemic. And what they ascertained in that study was that there was a marginal uptick in productivity, but people were happier. But the interesting thing is not everybody wanted to do it long term. Doesn't that sound familiar? That's exactly what we're talking about now. This was 2013, and it was a cohort of about 20,000 people that they studied. So, you know, go look at the research, go read it. It's still valid to this day.
And just one thing I'd say as well is I think that, you know, a lot of what we've discussed here is what employers want, but employees, in terms of talent attraction and retention, which maybe doesn't always get a huge amount of attention in public sector context, because, you know, it's one of the issues that doesn't come up as much, but I think with the next generation, it will. So if other organizations are offering greater flexibility and addressing needs they have, employers won't be competitive. So I think that the push comes from there as well.
Thank you, Alma. Alma, if you're happy, we'll wrap up your panel there. I know there was questions in there about legal obligations that Louise touched on. Just so you know, one of Louise's colleagues from Arthur Cox, Kevin Langford, will be specifically talking about the right to disconnect, another term that we've all had to get used to over the last year and a half. Thank you very much.